at this time to introduce the witness from Wyoming who is here, Mr. Slade Franklin. He has served as the Weed and Pest State Coordinator at the Wyoming Department of Agriculture since 2004. In this role, Mr. Franklin has developed statewide invasive species management programs that have been integral to protecting the health of Wyoming's ecosystem. He organizes, chairs, and he facilitates groups concerned about invasive species, like the Wyoming Annual Grasses Task Force and the Wyoming Interagency Weed and Pest Working Group. He has chaired the Western Weed Coordinating Committee and the State Weed Coordinators Alliance. In 2015, I was pleased that the Secretary of Interior agreed to my recommendation to appoint Mr. Franklin to serve as a member of the Invasive Species Advisory Committee. As a member of that committee, Mr. Franklin provides information and advice on invasive species-related issues to the National Invasive Species Council, which coordinates efforts to address invasive species issues at the national level. Mr. Franklin has represented Wyoming well as a member of the Invasive Species Advisory Committee. I know we will all benefit from hearing about his extensive experience in fighting invasive species in Wyoming and the challenges that they pose to our state's wildlife, our infrastructure, and our public health. Mr. Franklin, it's a privilege to welcome you here today as a witness before the Environment and Public Works Committee. Thank you for traveling to Washington, as well as when the legislature is in session at home. Delighted to have you here with us today. Mr. Franklin, please proceed with your testimony.
Chairman Barrasso, thank you for the welcome. Ranking Member Carper, as well as other members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. As mentioned, my name is Slade Franklin. I serve as a Weed and Pest Coordinator with the Wyoming Department of Ag. For the past 15 years, I've been working on the issue of invasive species in the state of Wyoming, the Western region, and the United States. Through my experiences, I've gained insight into the difficult task of managing invasive species. The extent of the problem is not just limited by industry, by location, or by economic impacts. Urban communities deal with the issue as much as the rural communities. Species like zebra and quagga mussels can impact water supplies for livestock and municipalities both. The impacts to the country from invasive species is economically staggering. Additionally, we are becoming more aware of the impact to our native wildlife. In the state of Wyoming and the Great Basin, invasive grasses such as cheatgrass and Medusa head rye are altering critical habitat for sage grouse and mule deer by transitioning sagebrush communities from a 50-year fire cycle to a 3-year fire cycle. The Bureau of Land Management reported that in the last 20 years, 74% of Department of Interior acres burned were on rangelands, and 80% of those 12 million acres were on cheatgrass invaded rangelands. 2016, the Invasive Species Advisory Committee published a paper outlining the problem invasive species presents for the country's infrastructure. The committee reviewed 4 main categories: power systems, water systems, transportation systems, and housing. The committee identified existing and potential threats to each of the categories due to invasive species that range from mussels to insects to animals such as burrowing iguanas and nutria. ISAC concluded that federal agencies currently lack the authority necessary to effectively prevent, eradicate, and control invasive species that impact the human-built environment. Invasive species not only impacts infrastructure, they utilize it. In 1896, U.S. Department of Agricultural botanist Lester Dewey was requested by Congress to research how western states could eradicate the invasive weed Russian thistle. Russian thistle had been introduced into South Dakota through contaminated flaxseed and it quickly established itself throughout the West and Midwest. Some of you may recognize Russian thistle as the tumbling tumbleweed co-starring in every Western movie ever made. In his report back to Congress, Dr. Dewey noted, next to the railroad yards and the wastelands in cities and villages, the roadsides are the most important avenue for the introduction of new weeds and for the propagation of old ones. They should therefore be watched with special care. Roads and rail lines are still one of the primary avenues by which invasive species move. We have watched invasive weeds such as yellow star thistle, an invasive plant that has infested over 14 million acres in California, creep its way east to Wyoming by following the interstates and highways. Introduced terrestrial pathogens and diseases such as West Nile virus can have a direct impact on human health. In Wyoming, the first confirmed case of West Nile virus was reported in 2002. Since then, Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, and South Dakota have some of the highest average annual incidence of West Nile virus or neuroinvasive disease reported to the CDC. The neuroinvasive disease can lead to encephalitis and meningitis, and in extreme cases, death. Between 1999 and 2017, over 2,000 deaths had been reported to the CDC due to the West Nile neuroinvasive disease, with an additional 137 deaths reported in 2018. As daunting as a task managing invasive species can be, successful management is realistic and achievable through partnerships involving federal, state, and county agencies, non-government organizations, land-grant universities, and critically important, the private landowner. In the same 1896 USDA bulletin, Dr. Dewey states, in nearly all cases, the landowner can do the work at much less cost than it can be done by public authorities. Federal and state government partners contribute greatly through their jobs and are deeply appreciated. But agricultural producers are passionate and financially motivated. Their livelihoods depend on healthy ecosystems. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Partners for Wildlife and the U.S. Forest Service's state and private forestry programs are essential tools in rewarding landowners with their habitat and weed management efforts that protect critical wildlife. We need to continue moving the dialogue on invasive species forward as to what role we can play in improving success by identifying what resources are already in place and what additional resources are needed. Just less than 50% of Wyoming is managed by federal agencies, and some of the most concerning infestations of terrestrial weeds occur on these public lands. When cross-jurisdictional programs are developed, local experts should be empowered by their respective federal agencies to make critical, time-sensitive decisions. Capacity can be improved through policy and legislative changes, but it also needs to be improved through funding. Invasive species programs have often relied on grants, short-term funding sources, which are helpful for immediate or initial treatments, but do little to assist with long-term program stability. Additionally, we need to improve funding for research and development in programs such as USDA ARS and land-grant universities such as the University of Wyoming. New funding is not the only solution. 2017, the National Interagency Fire Center reported firefighting costs were $2.9 billion to fight fires across 10 million acres. This works out to a cost of $290 per acre. A landscape-scale herbicide treatment of cheatgrass costs at most $60 an acre. Yet agencies are only treating a fraction of the known infested acres. If the medical adage, prevention is better than the cure, is true, it may be time federal agencies review how current firefighting funds are utilized and change the paradigm. Chairman Barrasso, thank you again for the invitation to speak with your committee. I'd like to close by congratulating you on receiving the 2018 Wyoming Weed and Pest Council's Guy Haggard Award. We appreciate all the work you've done in helping bring national attention to this issue.
Thank you.
I look forward to questions.
Thank you for your